Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining another Balerion Space Ventures podcast. We're joined by Awais Ahmed, founder and CEO of Pixxel, one of the leaders in hyperspectral imaging, building satellites. It's an amazing company that's leading the wave in Earth observation and satellite manufacture coming from India. Uh, Awais, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to get things started. Maybe you can talk about the founding moment. You started this company right out of college, if I remember correctly, and since then it's just taken off. So I'm curious about the lead up until the point where you wanted to then start Pixel and then how Pixel started.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. Firstly, great to be here. So started it while still in college, actually, so even before graduation. But I think a few things led to it. Like many people, I was quite fascinated and obsessed with space ever since I was a kid. I don't think that passion or obsession ever really left. It kind of got rekindled once I joined university as well in India. In my first and second year, I was part of a student satellite team that was working on satellites. This was a team that was working with the scientists at the Indian Space Research Organization. So that's where I learned how to design, build, and operate satellites. And then in my second and third year, I was one of the founding members and engineering leads at the Hyperloop India team. Now, this was around the time that Elon Musk was quite interested and fascinated with the Hyperloop. And as a part of that, SpaceX decided to conduct a competition at the sidelines. They built this 1 mile long vacuum tube at their headquarters in Hawthorne and put out a challenge to teams around the world to see who could build the fastest and the best pod. We thought we would participate because we thought it would be a good chance for us to maybe, meet Elon himself, who was an inspiration to anyone that was interested in space technology. And to our pleasant surprise, we got through the first stage. We took it a lot more seriously from there and then got through the remaining 4 or 5 stages. And finally, out of 2,500 global applicants, SpaceX gave a green light to 20 teams to build the design that we had presented them, a Hyperloop pod. And we were one of them. And now we had to really figure out how do you put something together that hasn't been put together, for which there is no how to guide. And we did that in a span of 2.5 months during our summer vacation. We brought the Hyperloop pod to the Hawthorne headquarters for SpaceX. And while we were there, we got to meet Elon. They took us on a tour of the SpaceX factory. So it was like my personal eureka moment to decide, looking at those rocket engines being built, looking at the Falcon 9 booster to have landed back on Earth for the first time, that I don't think there is another pathway for me in life except to work in space technology. So a very clarifying moment while there at the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne. Came back from there to college, entering the final year. And that's where I explored what was happening in space. Went a lot deeper into who was trying to build launch vehicles. Does it make sense to build, yet one more launch vehicle company? Are there other companies trying to do space stations? Is there in-space manufacturing that we can look at? But as a college student coming from, not a wealthy background or coming from India, especially, a lot of it seemed like way far out in terms of the capital expenditure that was needed. So we said, okay, maybe let's start with something small and grow from there. Let's see if we can utilize all of this satellite imagery that's coming down from orbit, from Planet Labs, from Airbus, from everyone else. And if we can build these AI models, if we can build a platform that can provide services on the basis of this data. So that's what we got started with. And then we were exploring this space on what kinds of satellite imagery would help us do what kinds of analytics. We came across hyperspectral imagery there. There were a few space agencies that had built and launched hyperspectral satellites, probably like 3 or 4 at the max. And they were fairly recent, with NASA leading the way. They had a satellite called EO1, Earth Observing 1, that had a hyperspectral sensor called the Hyperion, from which we looked at the hyperspectral data and we are like, wow, hyperspectral image shows us so much more than a multispectral image over the same area, because it captures light in so many wavelengths. And to our surprise, no one was doing it commercially. And that's where I think we saw the gap and said, okay, maybe we build our own satellites that have these hyperspectral cameras. It needed to be of a better resolution and quality than what had been put up there, and it needed to be at a frequency and coverage rate that the customers would pay for. So that's the genesis of the story for why Pixel began and why we decided to start it in the final year of our studies, and then it's taken off from there. Yeah.
Awesome. Maybe you could walk us through high level of how Pixel works and what hyperspectral imaging allows you to do versus, other types of imaging and Earth observation.
Absolutely. So when we decided that, hyperspectral imagery is what we wanted to do from satellites, a lot of it stemmed from the fact that we had actually run analysis of our own on hyperspectral data, on multispectral data, on optical data. And there was a lot of research papers that had started to come out fairly recently as well. This was in 2019. And they showed that, for the same image, hyperspectral imagery showed you roughly 20 to 50 times more information per pixel. Now, what does that actually translate in terms of use cases, and how did we convert that into the business model that we have? I think when you looked at, let's say, agriculture, and there's a multispectral image of a farm, and then you have a hyperspectral image of a farm. With a multispectral image, you can identify that one, it's a farm and there's some crops growing there, and you can do something called generation of an NDVI, natural differentiation vegetation index, that tells you how healthy the crop is. You can tell that it's green, it's yellow, it's red, and that's kind of about it. There's a lot of other limitations around what you can't do. But then when you have a hyperspectral image of the same farm, now you can identify what nutrient contents are present in the soil. If there's nitrogen missing and if a nitrogen fertilizer needs to be used, for example, it can help identify the exact species of the crops as well, which you can't with multispectral, whether it's wheat that we are growing or whether it's a particular type of wheat. Is it a GMO crop or is it a non-GMO crop? And as the crops are growing, we can identify if there are early signs of crop diseases. This is roughly 2 to 4 weeks before the symptoms even show up, or it translates into a change in the NDVI. And that's something we can do because of the change in spectral signatures we can detect from hyperspectral. So, one example is a lot of agricultural use cases would become insanely more efficient if you had hyperspectral over multispectral. The other examples would include, for example, in the oil and gas sector, you have a lot of these pipelines, and the pipelines are both above ground and underground. When it's above ground, let's say you have a methane pipeline and there's a leak that has come in from somewhere. Methane is generally invisible to human eyes. It's also invisible to multispectral cameras. But then in hyperspectral, you have a very specific narrow bands around the 1700 and 2100 nanometer range where methane reflects light or has a emittance peak, and that's something that we can detect even though it's invisible. If there's an underground oil leak in the pipeline, for example, we can't really see the oil itself because it's underground. However, it changes the characteristics of the soil or the vegetation around where the pipeline is, and so we can detect that change in the spectral signature of the soil and identify that there's oil that's seeped in there, and so therefore there's likely an underground oil leak. And the final example I can give you probably is around mining and mineral exploration. For a lot of the countries now, it's all about having self-reliance on having their own rare earth minerals and metals for the EV transition, whether that's cobalt, whether that's lithium, or whether that's something else. And hyperspectral imagery is unique because it can help exactly identify which mineral you're looking at and where. Like a very wonderful example of this is when the USGS, United States Geological Survey, they flew a plane with a hyperspectral camera over Afghanistan, and they found roughly $1 trillion worth of new deposits of ores that they hadn't found before. Imagine doing that at a global scale with satellites that have these hyperspectral cameras. And even beyond that, we help mining companies monitor what's happening with active mines and closed mines, and what the environmental impact is of those operations, and creation of the reports that these companies have to submit to different governmental agencies. So, those were the use cases we identified when we looked at what hyperspectral could uniquely do. And the plan was then, okay, build and deploy our own constellation of these hyperspectral imaging satellites into orbit. Very similar to what Planet had done in terms of having more satellites, have it as a constellation. But the way that we designed it is, instead of having hundreds of satellites, we would just need 18 satellites to have coverage of the landmass of the planet every day. And that's because each of our satellites has a lot more capacity than most others. So the plan was simple: build and deploy our own constellation of 18 satellites. These would be in low Earth orbit, in a sun synchronous orbit, so they would continuously keep orbiting the Earth. With the first phase, which is 6 satellites, we would still have a daily revisit anywhere on the globe. And a daily revisit becomes important because, unlike SAR, we are an optical sensor. We have to wait for the photons to come in. And so if there's cloud cover somewhere, we would need to capture on a daily basis, as clouds move around, for us to have a better chance at serving our customers. So having that daily revisit with the first 6 satellites was important. And then from there, the plan was to expand as we added more capacity. And what we do is we sell imagery from these satellites. We sell it generally on a subscription basis. Customers want to look at what's happening in their farms, in their pipelines, in their mines on either a daily basis or a bi-weekly basis or a weekly basis. And then we keep on delivering data at that frequency to them as and when we capture it. Beyond just the data, of course, we have a platform, an AI platform that enables analysis of this data to make sure that our customers can actually get to the end result they're looking for rather than just beautiful looking imagery. So that's how we go about it.
Very nice. Now, you might not like this, but you are probably India's most prominent young space founder. Pixel came on the map, and everyone in the space economy knows it. You know, coming up as a young founder in the most populated country in the world, how were you able to grow the private space ecosystem in India? What was it like when you started, and how did you break barriers and grow so fast and just open up a whole new ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, so I think things have changed drastically over, I would say, the last 7 years since we began, right? 2019, there was no space regulation or policy in India, and that's because for the longest while, it was only the Indian Space Research Organization that had the mandate to do anything space related. Yes, there were a lot of vendors who could provide components that had sprung up around the centers for the Indian Space Agency, but there wasn't really anyone that had built, deployed their own space hardware. Um, but I think what happened around 2018, 2019 is everyone around the world, not just in India, saw the success that SpaceX was having, saw the success that Planet Labs and Spire and a few others had started to show that commercialization of space ventures was possible. And that those success stories, I think, led to um, folks even in India starting to think about, yeah, maybe a private space company could be built. We decided we would just get started. There's nothing stopping us from building a satellite. It is basically a computer that has additional appendages attached to it that you can build on ground. There's no rules against building a satellite or a building computer. But then the challenge was, how do you get approvals to launch it to space? Because anyone launching a satellite needs approvals from the country of origin. And so what we did from day one is we set up a US entity also from the college dorm room, because there was a very clear regulatory pathway in the US. We could go through FCC for the frequency licensing, NOAA for the imaging licensing, while we worked with the Indian authorities to figure out how we go about that there. And so the satellite would be built, to start with in India, and then it would be transferred over to our US entity, and then from there we could sort of launch it. But then things started changing in India around 2020, 2021. As COVID sort of really ravaged the economy, the government was looking at ways in which to revitalize it. And one of the sectors they identified was space technology, where they said, okay, finally, I think we can really encourage the private sector to come in and do a lot more and work together with what the Indian Space Agency has been doing. It took about a couple more years after that to get the space policy finally out, but there was a very involved process where they would send us a draft. We would provide feedback on what could work from a private industry standpoint and whatnot. And so I think a large percentage of where we are today is, I think, we happened to be at the right place at the right time. We decided we wanted to get started on our plan of action regardless of whether there was regulation to allow it there or not, and we said we will figure it out internationally. US obviously was the primary market for us in terms of where the revenue would come from. We could also potentially look at Germany or a few other countries who would be willing to give us approvals for launching these satellites. But at the same time, we said let's work with the regulatory authorities, work with the Prime Minister's office to figure out how does this actually then be implemented for a lot of other companies to come. And so a lot of approvals we had to go through for the first time, and so we were in a little bit of sense a guinea pig as well, taking a lot of time on figuring out the back and forth on how this needs to go. But I think it's good. We really learned a lot from that, and we were able to take the best of what we saw in the US, best of what we saw in Europe, and translate that to the policy here as well. So function of being at the right place at the right time, being early as well. When we launched our first demo satellites in 2021 and 2022, we were the first company that started out of India that had ever launched a private satellite or a private imaging satellite as well. And I think from there we have built up now to actually launching the first constellation, privately built constellation last year in 2025. So I think it's come as a function of just deciding to, I think, lock in and figuring out that we will keep on building satellites and figuring out various ways to launch it. As long as they go up there, as long as they show utility, I think the rest of the things in the back end can be figured out.
Yeah. Are there anything that you think Western investors might underestimate about Indian deep tech startups?
I think the scale of what the market could be, I think just thinking about it logically, right? So you look at the amount of spending that the US does on space technology. A very small percentage of that comes from like the space budget. A large percentage of that space, funding actually comes from the defense budget. You look at what China has been able to do, in 2013 or 2014, they were, it was only the space agency in China as well that was doing stuff, and then they really opened it up. Today private companies do thousands of satellites, and they're also catching up with rockets, right? US has obviously taken off with SpaceX launching hundreds of rockets a year, etc. So I think India really does have those ambitions as well to be able to build, launch thousands of satellites a year, and have a cadence that's getting close to what SpaceX has, to be able to catch up to that. And there is appetite and there is the budget for that. So the India's defense budget, I think, is top three or top four in the world. And the percentage of spending into space technology has been 0% until probably 2 years ago. It's probably less than 1% today, and then it'll continue to grow towards like a 4 to 5% of spending over the next few years, and that's going to be a massive, massive chunk. And the other thing I think that maybe there's a little bit of a underappreciation for is there's a massive local ecosystem of suppliers and industries that have been built up around two industries, space and defense. These are suppliers that have been providing components to ISRO for rockets, for spacecrafts, for various different things. There's also a lot of suppliers that have popped up to support the defense research organization as well, where there are missiles built internally, there are airplanes built internally, engines built internally. So I think a lot of this talent was just not given the opportunity due to the policies for the longest while, but now that's starting to change. A lot of people wanting to work on deep tech, a lot of people wanting to work on these things. And what needs to catch up is, where will the grant money, where will the revenue eventually sort of come from? But all that's starting to get solved, and like the amount of talent that you will find in terms of working on these technologies, I think is going to continue to increase, and we will see that Cambrian explosion sort of come up over the next few years. So I think that's something to sort of keep an eye out on as well.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the traction Pixel's had to date. You have multiple of your systems and satellites in space. I think, maybe were one of the first Indian companies to have a partnership with NASA. Tell us about the milestones you've hit and what the future is going to look like for Pixel.
Absolutely. So, as I said, the first three satellites that we launched were all demos or pathfinders in 2021 and 22. The idea was we weren't even really sure if the kinds of resolution and quality we were looking at for hyperspectral data from space was possible. The best resolution that had been achieved when we started was 30 meters, and that was a NASA satellite that had cost $100+ million, had taken 7 to 10 years to build, exquisite systems, but then that was still not enough, and 30 meters had to be gotten down to 10 meters at the minimum because that's what customers were asking for, but 5 meters or lower ideally to be able to service a lot of those use cases. And so I think we really wanted to iterate our way to that 5 meter, and so we started with a 30-meter demo, then we went to a 10-meter demo, and then we saw so many learnings from what could be better, what could be faster, what could be more efficient. And then we finally built and launched six 5 meter commercial hyperspectral satellites last year. And the reason to get to 5 meter also is all of the multispectral offerings that you get, whether that's from Planet Labs or Earth Daily or a few others, are at 5 meters, right? And we didn't really want our customers to feel that they're losing out on the spatial resolution just because they're getting so many more wavelengths from hyperspectral. And so we said 5 meters is really what we had to get to. And it took every single effort that we had to put into to sort of get there, because it's all trade-offs. You try to bring the resolution down, the swath goes down, number of bands go down, you try to increase that, the resolution gets worse. But I think after a lot of iteration, we were able to finally, as I said, launch six of these satellites last year over two SpaceX launches. And the great part about it is, I think all six satellites that we sent up there worked. We were able to get in touch with them in within like the first orbit of communications. We were able to get the first light images as well down fairly quickly. For the first launch, it took about a couple of months to figure out all the commissioning out and the calibration out and bring those images down. But then when we did the second launch, we were able to get the images down as soon as the SpaceX downlink delay was cleared, which is using our expand radios to be able to bring the data data down. So that's less than 48 hours from launch. So I think that's from a technical standpoint, being able to put those six satellites was important because, as I said earlier, having a daily revisit is what would be possible with the six satellites. If we are looking at San Francisco today, we can come back and look at it again in 24 hours. Same holds true for London, Tokyo, New York, anywhere on the globe. And in terms of the commercial traction, I think what we did with the three demos was we really worked very closely with a few select industries and organizations within those industries. We worked with companies in the oil and gas sector. We worked with companies in the agriculture sector. We worked with companies in the mining sector, and we captured images of their farms, of their pipelines, of their mines with those demo satellites. And we built models that could help them identify minerals, identify crop diseases. And so we were able to not only talk about theoretically what hyperspectral could do, we were able to show them firsthand. As they say, a picture speaks a thousand words. In our case, it's literally two in our business. And With the demonstration that we did with those pilots, we were able to sign fairly long-term contracts as well. So in most cases, we ended up signing 3-year forward-looking contracts that when our commercial satellites would go up, and when we started delivering data of 5-meter quality, then there would be these contracts that would be ready waiting for us. And As we got closer to the launch of the Fireflies last year, we ended up signing more than 50 such customers globally, covering almost every geography, every continent, I would say, except Antarctica, where there's not many customers that buy data. And then the challenge was get these six satellites up there and then start delivering data. And so we started doing that as well last year. And now I think we are at that stage where there's like way more demand than supply at this point in time, and that's because we are still figuring out how to make these satellites way more efficient. For example, we will upload compression algorithms where we can downlink roughly 3 to 5 times more imagery over the next few days, for example. So I think it's a good place to be in where there's a lot more demand than we anticipated even in the early days for hyperspectral. A lot of it is pent up demand also, and a lot of these companies that we are working with, they have experimented with hyperspectral. So we didn't really have to convince them why hyperspectral. They'd already seen that through drone images. They'd already seen that through handheld spectrometers. We just happen to be providing them for it in a large scale. Going forward from here, as I said, the six satellites will end up becoming an 18 satellite constellation. Six more will launch next year, and then there'll be six more that will go up in 2028. And then beyond that, we are also expanding from hyperspectral to adding other types of modalities in our constellation as well, predominantly from the deal we signed with the government of India to build India's national satellite imaging constellation, where we will add sub-meter high resolution satellites, where we will add a couple of synthetic aperture radar satellites. So the idea is the Aurora platform that we have that provides these analysis will not only have hyperspectral data as its core offering, it can combine itself with other types of data sets. We will partner with a lot of organizations that currently provide that data set as well, and then provide those insights through multi-data fusion models. So that's the plan going forward on the imaging side of the business.
Got it. And what would you say just for, space infrastructure and space hardware companies like yourself, one of the big bottlenecks are where if you could wave a magic wand and fix one problem, it would just open the floodgates for so much more opportunity. Would it be something like maybe manufacturing or just launch cadence?
Yeah, I think for us, it's if I were to wave a magic wand, I would make the detectors that we use for our cameras a lot faster and a lot larger, right? So when we were looking at hyperspectral sensors, there are very few companies that could provide the detectors, firstly, that could detect the wavelengths that we need. And then we had to take it and convert that into the hyperspectral aspects. But like, for example, if you're looking at mercury cadmium telluride detectors, we, for example, looked at a detector that could do what we needed to do at roughly the size we wanted to do it. And this was used in telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope or JWST, right? And then so each of these would end up costing us about $5 to $10 million, just the detector. And so we have to then work with the other models that are a little bit more mass built so that the cost sort of comes down, but then that kind of affects the quality. Like we could possibly do like a meter or sub-meter today with hyperspectral if you could just wave a wand and at a foundry level make these detectors a lot faster and a lot larger. But I think that's just personally me. In terms of, I think, businesses like us where we need the constellation to sort of go up there, I think launch has mostly solved itself. I think if you're willing to wait, like, every 3 months, SpaceX has a transporter rideshare mission going up every 3 or 4 months. You just have have to make sure you show up on time. You just have to make sure your testing reports are in order, and then it's like a train. You show up on time, they'll get you from point A to point B. And I think in terms of manufacturing, I think that's something that yes, I think it really helps when you have a large, economies of scale, which is also why over the last 12 months or so, we've gotten into the business of satellite manufacturing as a service, right? And that was because we already had the infrastructure. We had our clean rooms, we had our testing facilities where we were building our own satellites. But then when certain agencies approached us and said, would you be willing to build some satellites for us as well? We were like, yeah, very happy to, because all we had to do is replicate the exact same process in the same infrastructure, the same facilities that we had. And we were able to now take the same satellite platforms we're building for ourselves, remove the hyperspectral camera, put some other payload for the agencies that are looking at it, and then providing it to them. As every country now starts to bring this more in-house, given the sovereignty related shift that has happened over the world, I think we will be better placed to be able to provide it at a cost-effective manner, because not o- no, because we don't have to depend only on external orders to keep the flywheel running. We have our own satellites that will keep on getting manufactured, assembled, and launched. We will at the same time have many other satellites, a multiple of those satellites being built for other agencies, other countries, other organizations. And together, the fact that we can place an order for a lot more components together means that the cost for each component comes down. It means that we can keep an inventory of stock rather than have to order it whenever we have a new contract or a new satellite that we need to build. And so then the turnaround time for each satellite ends up being as small as 3 months or 2 months, rather than like 12 months or 18 months, because most of that 18 months is waiting for the components to arrive. So I think the economies of scale brings down the cost. It helps us have a much better handle on the supply chain that exists, and then we can take those efficiencies and make our constellations much, much more efficient as well.
Got it. I want to talk about the data pipeline. So once an image is captured, what happens next? How do you process all this data efficiently and turn it into insight?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest learnings we've had is hyperspectral data requires a lot of coaxing and a lot of processing to get to a point where it's deliverable. Because customers are used to seeing data in a certain format. They're used to seeing it in level two, which is bottom of atmosphere reflectance. They're expected to see it working with all of the platforms they currently work with, like Esri and Envy. So what goes through the process, right? So you have when the camera is capturing the image, it takes these photons, it converts them into electrons, and then the avionics that we have basically converts them into zeros and ones, which is your raw level zero data. That's basically a function of zeros and ones. And then you convert that into various levels of level 1A and level 1B. What you're doing there is you're doing geometric correction, which means that the image that you have taken has to align itself exactly with the coordinates of the map that you're looking at, right? So we've taken an image of, let's say, River Nile. We can't put it over a map and then Nile is not really over Nile. And so the geometric correction has to make sure that the stretching and thinning of the images that happen because of how fast you're capturing these images in space has been laid down exactly on top of how they're supposed to be on planet Earth. So that's geometric correction. We have to do something called radiometric correction, which is making sure that the radiance values are aligned with what you actually see on the ground. And then you have to do something called atmospheric correction, which is you have this entire layer of atmosphere between your satellites at 500 kilometers and the ground that you're capturing. And that includes certain artifacts and other things. And so you have to basically remove all of those through what we call the process of atmospheric correction. So instead of seeing top of atmosphere radiance values, we're seeing bottom of atmosphere reflectance values, which is what light has been reflecting from the surface without the disturbances that we are seeing from the atmosphere. So once these three corrections are done, then you arrive at level 2 data. And level 2 data is what is provided to customers as a pre-process as an image that's been pre-processed to a point where it can be directly sent to analysis models. All of this has to be automated because we're operating 6 satellites. Each satellite is capturing hundreds of images a day. They're sent down to the ground stations that we have around the globe. They come to our servers where they're stored, and then automatically the pipeline gets triggered, and it has to go through various levels of automated quality checks. And at the end, there's also someone doing manual quality checks as well. So I think that's the entire process that will have to be managed before an image is even ready to be sent to our customers. And then beyond that, there's post processing and analysis, but this is just to make the image ready.
Got it. Uh, okay, I want to shift gears a little. So part of being a good CEO and entrepreneur is you can be highly technical and very skilled at that, but if you want to grow very big, you have to be really good at hiring. And you're one of the biggest space companies in India, which has a lot of people who I'm sure look at this as, you know, the SpaceX of India, maybe you could say, and are applying. And you have hundreds of employees. So I'm curious what it's like to grow a company in India and select the right candidates. What are you really looking for? And how do you plan to scale from here? I know you're going in the United States as well and India, and this is just becoming a global company.
Yeah, so I think we've been kind of US India dual company for a very long while for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the market and stuff like that. We have 270 people in the organization now, 30 of which now are in the US, and about 220 or so are in India, and roughly 10 people are in Europe and a little bit of rest of the world. So it's as you said, like a global company because once you put these satellites up there, they are kind of global. So in terms of building up the team, I think it comes down to like a very few set of principles. The very early team that we hired, I think we were very, very thoughtful and we took our time in getting those people on board. And I think, instead of generally taking 2 or 3 months to get those hires, sometimes it ended up taking us 6 months or 8 months for us to get the right hire in. Because not only were we looking for someone with the right technical skills, these folks had to have an entrepreneurial bent in them as well. Like they have to take initiative. They had to make sure that they could see through things to the end result and not be given guidance or not be guided on a daily basis. So that initiative and that passion and the fact that they will just get things done, I think we needed to make sure that they had that in them. And then the cultural aspect of it as well. Will they move fast? Will they assimilate with the team? Will they be willing to take risks in a startup that they, generally would not be willing to take at the space agency or somewhere else? So thankfully, I think, since, as I said, we were very early in the space tech journey in India as well. A lot of the news articles that came out really highlighted that, and it was a little bit easy to get into the news articles because no one else was really doing a lot of satellites at that point in time. That really helped, I think, with when we reached out to someone from the Indian Space Agency and asked them, "Hey, we're building this startup outside of what ISRO has been doing. Would you want to come on board and sort of help us and lead this function?" Having a little bit of that brand built up really helped in convincing at least a few of them. And in India, it's not so easy to leave a government job which provides a lot of other cushions and insurance, etc., to move to a private sector, especially if it's an early stage startup. But I think it was an exciting time, and the goals that we were going after were exciting enough for the folks we hired to come on board. So that cultural aspect was as important as looking at their technical skills and can they just get things done. And it has worked out because those are the same folks that we hired 5 years ago or 6 years ago that are now leading their entire functions. They're leading the entire mechanical division, for example. They're leading the entire mission design analysis division. There were a few gaps that we couldn't hire for in India just because not a lot of it had been done in the country. For example, hyperspectral camera design and analysis. We had to hire our chief camera scientist in California with someone who had worked on it for the US government, had worked on other various different missions, and sort of figure out how we will do that in the US, for example. So I think it's things like that where we said doesn't matter the geography, we will hire the best person for the job as long as they have the cultural fit as well. So that ended up having a few folks for us out in California that we hired, a few folks in Bangalore that we hired in the early stages, and they became the core team. One of the things that I think we pride ourselves most on is the attrition that we have is kind of quite low, and the attrition we have at the senior level is almost zero. And that's because these folks have lived with us and breathed with us and seen difficult times and sort of come through out of it. And that I think as long as that core is good, it works. And then what happens is when these folks are hiring their teams, they're looking for the same kind of cultural bent as well. They're looking for folks who can get it done. They're looking for folks who can take initiative and can fit into that culture. And it creates a positive feedback loop that percolates across the entire organization. At some points in time, we've had to go in and sort of hire folks because you realize that okay, this person is great at when it's a small startup and a great small organization, but then as you start growing and you need to start putting a slightly bit more structure in place, it's just a function of the fact that these folks were more suited to a small team or more suited as an individual contributor. So to make that call very quickly that this person, we shouldn't make him lead just for the sake of making him lead. He can be a wonderful individual contributor, still having a lot of influence, but then bring in someone else to put structure to that point in time. So that balance, I think, has been the toughest to sort of strike for us. But hire the best people we think we can anywhere in the globe. Doesn't matter if they're in California or Seattle or Colorado. That's what we have done in US and India, and then that's worked out fairly well for us.
Nice. How do you manage a team so large, half in India, half in the United States, where quite literally it's the other side of the world and a 12-hour time difference? I'm curious about that. You must be tired a lot or travel a lot.
You don't sleep. That's how you manage it. No, I think as I said, if you hire people that know what they're doing, you don't necessarily need to be on top of them all the time. But the founders, we are young, the early team is young, and so right now is the team for us to go really hard. So, for example, when I'm in India, we have a usual working day from let's say 9 to 6 or 9 to 7, and then there's a couple of hours gap in between where we have dinner, and then meetings start again at 9 p.m. or 9:30 p.m. because the US has woken up, and then you do 3 or 4 more hours of that work. It gets reversed again when you come back to the US, spend time in the US during the day, and then there's, a couple of hours of break, and then meetings start again in the night when India has woken up. So I think a few folks have to do that anyway. There's no way around it. I also end up traveling quite a bit every month to the US, a month here and a month there. That ends up making sure that there's still that personal touch with all of the 250 to 70 folks that we have in the organization. But most of it is if I'm traveling somewhere and I'm on a let's say a conference or going on a meeting tour, I don't really have to worry about will the day-to-day function or not, because the second level leaders and other folks that have grown into the company, I know that they can handle it. And if they can't, they can just pick up a phone and call me anytime. They have my co-founder to call to as well. They have a few other leaders and folks that they can reach out to as well. So I think it wasn't as easy, obviously, in the first 2 years as a very small team of less than 10 people. Like, you have to do many things yourself. But I think as the team has grown, just having these folks you can depend on and trying to split your time equally and being where you need to be, I think has worked out. But I think youth also helps.
Nice. Yeah. So, many people see Earth observation as foundational for climate intelligence, agriculture, decarbonization, mining. But what do you see as the next layer beyond that?
Yeah, I think the probably the biggest gap in Earth observation has been not the availability of data, right? You've had lots of data that have come down for a longest while. I think it's a little bit of how do you take that and provide it to customers, right? In the first 2 decades or so, lots of companies were happy with just providing data, and 75-80% of that went just to the governments for various different strategic and intelligence use cases. And over the last 10 years to 15 years, we have seen a lot of analytics companies come up whose focus is we will take satellite data and we will analyze satellite data and provide services. But I don't think there's been enough of them to be able to get to that point where an actual little farmer could buy a service that is being provided due to a variety of different factors, either because the pricing from earth observation sector has not been well enough. Like, for example, beyond a certain point, archive data has really no value, so make it free. And Umbra did really well at this. Like, I think beyond a certain date, they have all of the archive data as free, and that what it does is it catalyzes the amount of data and models that can be built. And then the recent up-to-date frequent data sets is what people pay for, and that's where most of the revenue is made for anyway, because customers who want to know what's happening when it's happening is really where most of the revenue comes from. But a large part of the market has completely been missing, who have not even been able to buy data because of that lack of last mile connectivity. How do you take the data and not just have a generic model that provides solutions, but it is customized for them? And now with LLMs and different geospatial foundation models coming in, I think we're starting to see that being plugged as well. Also, I think while a lot of data has come down traditionally, it has been similar, the very same kind of data. You had companies that were all doing sub-meter resolution for intelligence use cases, and then you had a few companies doing multispectral data for the same kinds of use cases. But then you had Sentinel and you had Landsat that was providing a little bit of that free data, lower resolution, yes, but it was there. With radar and with hyperspectral, I think the other thing that we've had to struggle with is education, because this is a data set that there is no open source equivalent for. There is no 2 decades or 3 decades of work built on top of it. And so for us, it became an existential thing that we had to build our own platform as well, from where not only can we provide the data, but actually provide the models that can help analyze it, and try to plug that last mile gap as much as possible. The best way to do that globally and at a large scale is every country, every geography has a lot of these analytics companies that are taking different data sets and combining and providing forward. That makes the satellite imaging companies much richer, that makes these folks much stronger, and then globally it sort of grows. And now, as I said, with LLMs and foundation models, I think we will get close to where customers can customize different things for themselves as well. So I think that's the next step for us personally. As I said, like beyond hyperspectral, it's try to bring different kinds of data sets all under one umbrella, because no one data set is a silver bullet. For you to have a as full of an understanding of our planet as possible, for us to build a truly, true kind of planetary intelligence, we need to have multimodal data fusion, not just from satellite imagery, but also other types of satellite data like weather. You have tomorrow.io that's doing a wonderful job in sort of having that. You have Spire that provides a lot of weather data, soil moisture data, and so on. And then you need to have it combined with other types of weather station data and IoT data. And then when you're able to bring all of this together at a large scale, I think planetary intelligence starts becoming possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you have to run in just a moment, but as we're wrapping up from our conversation, what is one big takeaway you'd want someone listening to have after they finish hearing this recording or leave this webinar?
Yeah, I think I think don't get disheartened when people say no in this business. People will say no a lot. That includes your potential customers in the early stage, hires you really want to have, investors, obviously. I think what one needs to do in this business, something that maybe I've learned over the last few years and still learning, is make sure there's a strong thesis that's built up from first principles, in terms of why you're doing what you're doing. Is it like just a trend that you saw and then you think you could sort of bank on top of that? But then what is the underlying problem that it's trying to solve? And as you earlier yourself alluded to, I think a lot of space founders are in it because of the love for space and they're very technical in nature. But you also have to look at the business aspects of it. As founders, I think you can't ignore that at all. So from day one, or in fact day zero, make sure that you're talking to your customers. Make sure that what you're trying to sell to the customers, they are validating it, and you're not just assuming it that if you build it, they will come. In a very few amount of cases, they will, but in a lot of cases, you end up spending tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's not even exactly what the customers wanted, and then you can't really go back and rerun that process. So talk to your customers, figure out what the market will be, figure out the economics of it. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be profitable today on day one, but fast forward to 5 years, fast forward to 7 years from where you're starting, and imagine what the world will be when your service is online, what they're paying for it. Do the economics even make sense? Does the impact even make sense? As long as I think you have these first principles, just keep on knocking on enough investors' doors, and eventually money will come. Keep on knocking on enough customers' doors, and customers will come. And I think at that point, it's just resilience. So I'll probably leave with that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Always. This has been fantastic to get the conversation with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you for reaching out, and thanks for having me here, Aidan.
All right. Hope to speak soon. Thanks so much and take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.